Hey guys, my name is Christian. Hopefully you are all doing well and welcome back to yet another tutorial here on my channel. So on today's episode I thought that I show you guys the remix that I did on the Jens Bogren Drum sample pack video. On that particular episode I just showed you how I stacked the samples, but this time around I will show you the complete process. We'll start off by listening to the final result, and then I'll see you back here in Pro Tools to show you my mix process. So let's listen to the music and I'll see you back here in a bit. We'll start here with listening to the raw drums here without any triggers and processing. Just the basic levels are set, nothing else. So quite decent, but definitely not as punchy and over the top as it has to be. So what I like to do when I mix this kind of music is that I start off with the kick and snare, and when I use samples I tend to use different samples that complement each other. So because it's very hard to find, one sample that fulfill all your wet dreams of fat kick and snares, so you have to blend samples, and here I got a couple of samples from the Jens Bogren package, and I'll show you guys how they sound soloed here. So that's a very nice punchy kick. The roundhouse dry has a bit more of that club attack, around 100 to 150 hertz. The ball slap dry is a bit the same, but the club attack is a bit higher in the range. And the plumbous dry, some more mids, very dry. Harder please, quite punchy, slappy. And the chic slap dry, which is very in your face, and I'd imagine this sample is very nice if you just want the kick to be a bit more upfront in the mix. And this is what they sound like played together. And you might ask yourself why I phased flipped one of the samples quote unquote wrong, but I do think that all sorts of interesting things can happen if you flip things wrong. And I'd can recommend you guys trying that on different sources. When you mix, sometimes very interesting things can happen, and you can definitely make things sit together better by flipping the phase wrong. And this is probably just something that I did on the fly. I thought that it sounded nice. The kick was a lot more scooped when I flipped the phase wrong here, and I thought that it worked in context of the music. And then I used two plugins here. First is the Bark of Dog, which is kind of a Pultic style EQ, and it's a freeware if you want to check that out. And then I used the Waves Max Bass plugin, which adds bass harmonics to the signal, so you can blend it here, the max bass signal, and pull back the original bass if you'd like. And I think that's a nice way if you want to even out the low end, make it a bit more even, and I'll show you guys what it sounds like on and off. So in this case, it definitely takes away some of that super low end, makes it a bit tighter, and that's just something that I preferred when I mixed it. We'll see how it all comes together in the end here. And then we have an ambience kick drum here, and it's the same drill, you know, blending different samples with different characteristics to get one kick ambience sound. I'll show you guys what it sounds like. So the ball slap wet has a bit of that nice low end, the cheek slap wet a bit more mid punch, and the cheek slap overhead even more mid punch. So yeah, and then I use the Kramer tape plugin, and this one adds compression, saturation, and just shapes the sound a bit differently. I'll show you on and off here. So definitely affect the kick in a great way. Otherwise, I don't tend to use tape plugins, but on certain sources, I kind of like it, and the Kramer tape is kind of nice. And let's play the two tracks together. So as you could hear, the kick ambience microphone is a huge part of the sound. And then we have a couple of other effects, and these two tracks are routed to a kick auxiliary bus, and I have some parallel compression here at first. Just to add some punch to the kick drum. And then I use a CLA, the Blue Stripe here, an 1176 clone plugin. And this one is something that I usually don't use on the kick, but it has a nice mid-forward sound, so I guess I liked it and wanted the kick to be a bit more upfront, so I used this one to get that result. And also boosted the volume, as you could hear, so it might be hard to hear what it actually does, but it's quite subtle. But yeah, it's just something that I did here in this mix. And then we come to something that I've developed over the years, and that is to use multiband compressors on practically all of my buses, and I use it as a dynamic shape tool rather than the typical use, which would be perhaps where you have certain frequencies that might be a bit much on certain chords, like on palm muted guitars. But I use it as the signal always exceeds the threshold. So and then I play around with the attack and release times to shape the source. So here we have the range, which is 5 decibels of gain reduction, and the gain is just to add back to the signal, so we don't get 5 dBs of EQing. And the attack times is quite slow, but the whole point is that the faster the attack time, the tighter the source will become. The longer release time that you use, the tighter the source will be. So I just found that this is a great way to add punch, cohesiveness, and just make the mix come together. So it adds a bit of top end, cuts some low mids, but definitely add a lot of punch to the kick. And then I use the SSL bus compressor, and I know a lot of people have replaced this one, but what I like about the Waves one is that they actually get the knee of the compressor completely right as the vintage original. It has a very steep knee which tightens up the source, so I tend to use it with either 0.10 or 0.3, usually 0.3 on individual tracks and then 0.10 on auxes and on buses. And this one has 0.3 release time, but otherwise I tend to use it on auto. So we'll see what it does here. So you can hear that the kick becomes a bit more centered, a bit more focused, which I like. And then in the end here I have an EQ that I probably did listening to the other instruments, and it's just to cut some 100 hertz here. And then we'll move on to the snares, and first we start with the real snare, which sounds like this. So it's just a normal typical snare with an SM57. The bleed is quite high, but that's just how it is sometimes. Perhaps bad engineering on my part. And then I used the SSL bus compressor on the track, and I just feel like adding a tiny bit of compression on most of the tracks, especially on drums, just adds some excitement and depth to the drums, so it sounds like this. So it just comes alive a bit more, which I like. And then we'll move on to the first trigger track here. And it's the same drill here. I've stacked different samples that complement each other, but I'll go through them here as well. So first the Spanker Dry, Ringy Punchy sample. Wanker Dry has a bit more low-end punch. Meat Stick Dry has a nice sustain. As the sustain can definitely help the snare to pop in the mix. And then the Super Nice Dry here, which sounds very nice, very punchy, has a bit more mid punch, which I really like. And then we have a bonus track here, which is included in the deluxe package of the Jens Bogren sample pack, which is basically a transient. Sounds terrible on its own, but it can help the snare to pop in the mix, and this is what it sounds like when they are all played together. So very nice, very big sounding snare. And then we have an ambience snare trigger track here as well. And it's the same drill here, how I stack the samples. We'll go through them as well. So you kind of get the basic idea, one low tune, one a bit more mid tune, high tune, and the snare 10 here is from the Slate sample pack, which has a nice splash, kind of 2K mid-range, which is nice to add to this snare. And then some basic EQ. I've cut out some low end. You don't really want that on the sides, filling up the whole sound field. And then I added some brightness around 2 kilohertz and some top end. So quite a lot happened there with that EQ. And then I tend to really compress the snare ambience a lot, and it's one of my favorite settings here, 0.3, 0.3. Just makes everything more snappy and pops in a nice way. So that one definitely transforms this track to something else. And I do feel that you can compress the snare ambience 8 to 12 dBs without a doubt. And then I have some additional EQ, probably something that I did listening to the tracks in the mix with the other instruments playing. And the Pultic EQ is mainly for the sound. It feels like it smooths out the transient tiny bit and adds some mid-range. I'll show you guys what it sounds like. So it feels like it adds something around 1 to 2 kilohertz, which I like. And then we'll listen to all the tracks playing together here. So the snare ambience, like the kick ambience, is a huge part of the whole sound. And then I have these 3 tracks routed to an auxiliary, which just adds some EQ here at first, the NSSL plugin. Some low-end body and some high-end sparkle there at 8 kilohertz. And then I use a multiband compressor here as well. And it just feels like it makes it a bit more punchy and tightens up the whole sound of the snare. And then here at last we have a parallel compression plugin once again. And just adds some more punch. And then I tend to use 3 different reverbs on the snare. The first one is a room reverb, which is probably this bus, 13 to 14. And room reverbs is something that is very nice if you want to make something sound a bit more cohesive, and also to push things back if you'd like. And then I use a small reverb, which is a tiny bit longer, to add some decay, around 80 milliseconds, and then a slightly longer reverb, perhaps like 1.2 seconds, to add some more tail. And this is just something that you can blend to taste. There's nothing right or wrong here, and since there's a lot of decay on the ambience track, snare ambience, I don't use that much reverb here. but it adds some decay and some punch and 3D feel to the snare. And then we can listen to the tom part here in the end. And we'll listen to the real toms here first, which is Audio-Technica ATM 450s, which are very nice, affordable microphones. Sound good on toms, snare, and just sounds a bit more like you'd imagine a great tom sound, how that would sound like, instead of like a 421, which sounds quite boring when it's soloed. So these are very, very nice, affordable microphones. And here I just added some EQ, multiband compression. I'll show you guys. And this is a great way to add some space to the snare, because sometimes when there's a tom part or a tom fill with the snare coming in as well, the snare can sound a bit too mid heavy, and this is probably just to cut and leave some space to the snare to pop through the real snare and the trigger snare tracks. And then I have samples here as well. Sounds a bit over the top, but I've set these levels listening to the mix, the whole mix. So these are just the level that I felt sounded good, you know, punchy enough, big enough sounding for this part. And here I used some parallel compression once again, and I'll show you guys, and also a multiband compressor and some EQ. I'll put them on as we go here. So you can hear that the real toms adds some low mids to the sound and some punch, which I usually feel that MIDI drums lack, and that's the same with the real snare. When you add a real snare, even if it's quite low in the mix, it just adds a touch of human feel and a punch, which is quite hard to get using only MIDI drums. And you might feel that the tom samples are loud, as I said, but the overheads will also help it sound a bit more natural. But of course, natural is perhaps an exaggeration, but at least not as mechanical as it sounded now. And let's listen to the overheads here as well. So these sound quite nice. This is Neumann KM84, the vintage ones. And as you can hear, also the room is extremely small. I had a very small studio before, and but they sound quite nice. I also used quite a lot of automation. I was really into left-right separation, which I perhaps overdid. I tend to not overdo it nowadays, but it sounds quite nice to have that left-right separation. But here you have the automation lanes, just to see how I did it. You know, here you have a cymbal hit, which is then ducked down, and then you have the hi-hat parts, etc. So that's a nice way. It takes some time, but you know, it can definitely make the sound image a bit cleaner, which can definitely help in this genre where you have, you know, lead guitars, synths, a lot of vocals, etc. So, and then I have some basic EQ here. So I tend to use compression on all of the drum tracks. It just adds some excitement, like I said before, and this is mainly to catch the peaks of the snare. Then I have a multiband compressor, which does the same thing as the other ones that I used on the other buses. And then I have some EQ here. And the thing is, in this genre, you probably have to make the overheads darker than you think that you would in the beginning, just to make space for the other instruments. The low end is cut here because you don't want that low end on the sides, like I said before. And here is just a cut to make room for the other instruments. And then I used a room reverb here to just get some decay into the overheads and push them back a bit. And when the room is such small as I had in that studio, it's also to simulate an actual room of a bigger sized room. So it added some square meters to the sound. And all of these tracks are routed to a drum master bus. And there I have another multiband compressor, which tightens up the sound, and an SSL bus compressor. And the bus compressor has a very fast release time, which will make the drums a bit more aggressive. And the multiband compressor darkens the sound a bit. That's something also that I probably did listening to the other instruments, which might have been a bit much, but you know, we do certain decisions on the fly, and yeah, it is what it is. So yeah, so that is basically what I did here on that mix. If you wonder what all these trim plugins are, this is my way of setting the levels and checking phase on certain tracks. I like to have my faders set at 0 before I do any automation. It's just easier to keep track between tracks if you mix multiple songs in one session. So then you know between songs that all the faders should be on 0. And yeah, that is basically it. If you like this kind of content and if you want me to do more tutorials, give me suggestions, give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and hopefully I'll see you guys around.